Welcome, and for my returning viewers, welcome back. I've chosen my next series to center around everyone's favorite colony simulator turned war crime factory. It's Rimworld. It should really go without saying, but I absolutely love this game, and I have been looking forward to doing a series on it for weeks, so let's just jump right in. First things first, this is going to be an almost vanilla run. I absolutely want to play around with various mod pack builds later on, and the DLC for this game is phenomenal, but I figured for the first series I should try and keep it simple for the folks who are less experienced with it. Of all the mods I'm running, most of them are just to improve cosmetic experience or offload micromanagement, because hoo boy does this game have a lot of micromanagement, and I'm not going to be using them to break vanilla balancing. Except for stop, drop, and roll. This mod makes it so that pawns, even ones that I don't control like raiders, don't turn into gibbering morons every time they get set on fire. In my experience, this mostly seems to help tribal raiders way more than it does me, but I think the mechanic is so overpowered and annoying that I am willing to accept that trade-off. So what are we doing here? The challenge for this run is, succinctly, world domination. I will start with one pawn, which is the Rimworld speak for a colonist, with nothing but the clothes on my back and some scenario editing to make re-rolling the pawn's traits faster. That pawn is my avatar and must be alive at the end of the game. This is notably not the same thing as saying the pawn never dies, though I will obviously try to avoid that. Using my avatar, I must then build a colony and wipe out every settlement on the map. But, of course, there's a goosey twist. For starters, there are no friendly settlements anymore. Everyone hates me and wants me to die, which is fair, given that I am essentially a one-bird extinction event waiting to happen. Also, the planet is basically Hoth, but colder and wetter. The game is going to be set to the hardest difficulty on Randy Random, except instead of the 220% threat scaling, I'm cranking it up to the maximum of 500% because I think it's funny. For reference, the hardest vanilla game mode caps out at 220%. I'm not enabling hardcore mode because I don't trust mods to not break things, but I also won't be reloading saves for game progression reasons, and I'm gonna crank up the map size a bit because I like to build big. I set up my world conditions to only allow younger cannibalistic pawns in my character selection screen, so instead of the 20 plus minutes of character rerolling that usually accompanies the start of any of these challenge runs, I am able to get a pawn pretty quickly. These setup traits have no effect for the rest of the game, by the way, this is just a time-saving thing. Meet Neurotic Goose, or just Goose for short. Goose was selected for 3 reasons. The first is their passion for construction and melee combat. The second is their quick learner trait, which is something I honestly value higher than almost anything else in early pawns. And the third is that they randomly rolled with a duster as an additional inventory item. Construction tends to be a fairly rare skill for young pawns to have high levels in because of the relative lack of compatible backstories, and honestly, even a 4 is pretty solid. But Quick Learner, when combined with a high passion for it, should result in Goose becoming a master engineer in record-breaking time. Melee combat is likewise useful because I'm going to be doing a fair bit of it at the start, though I suspect I will want to not have my mission-critical pawn slugging it out with a sword in the late game, so that is probably going to be phased out. Immediately after landing, I pause the game and configure all the defaults to my liking, and then start taking stock. I'm not really thrilled with what I'm seeing. Geothermal vents are scattered all around the map, but none of them are particularly close to steel-bearing ruins, which means I am going to struggle to construct shelter in time to prevent death by hypothermia. Also problematic, although not necessarily for the long term, is the lack of component veins and gold. Everyone wanting to kill me means no traders, which means both of these can't be purchased until I get a communication console working. I can survive without gold, but components are a hard requirement for basically any advanced electronic or mechanical building ever, and I'm gonna have to make some very long trips to dig out what few sources of them I have. My first priority is shelter. The one good thing is that my duster is of an excellent quality, which should help hold back hypothermia at least a little bit. The first target is a steel table I spotted in a ruin. In this game, deconstruction yields 50% of the original construction cost of a building, and since 2x2 tables cost 50 materials, this gives me exactly enough steel to make a steel door. Doors are substantially more expensive and slower to construct than walls, so I make sure to build that immediately while my hypothermia isn't particularly bad to minimize failure risks. Once that's done, I direct Goose to mine out a couple chunks of steel ore. Goose is kind of terrible at it, but 2 blocks of ore still produces 50 steel, and that is more than enough to allow for the creation of my brand new panic shack, even with hypothermia starting to set in. Great! Now I have an extremely inconvenient way to avoid freezing to death. That only took all day. Next on the priority list is food. There are some snow hares around the map that can be eaten, but otherwise there's nothing even remotely edible, so we need to secure those bunnies. Goose has warmed up, though perhaps cooked is a better description at this point, so I send him out on another mining mission to get the materials to make a knife. Fists make for terrible melee weapons, and rabbits will fight back with scratches that can cause infection, which, with Goose's non-existent medical skills, basically will spell instant death if he gets, so it's important to craft the knife to shorten the engagement time as much as possible. Clubs would be better, but mining takes a while, and I'm really on the clock here and would prefer to get some food into him as fast as possible. Knife in hand, rabbit number 1 goes down after getting only a single bite in. Goose takes it back, gets his bite in, and then spends the rest of the day or so hunting down anything that can move, with generous breaks in between to warm up and patch up. Randy even gets in on the fun and is nice enough to send me some Rimworld-style DoorDash in the form of driving one of the rabbits crazy, which at least saves me the trouble of running them down, I guess. By this point, Goose is not having a good time, which is understandable. I would love to be able to let him rest, but we are working against a clock. You see, not only is there nothing for Goose to eat on this map, there is nothing for rabbits to eat either. They realize this right as Goose finishes up his second lunch on legs, and if I don't get them now, they are going to leave, taking all of their nutritious giblets with them. So even though Goose is one step away from psychotic meltdown at this point, he has to keep hunting. Goose is able to secure kills on all of the remaining rabbits on the map, but soon after the stress of the situation gets to him and he breaks down into a berserk rage. This is, ironically, the best case scenario. Berserk rages tend to not last very long, and Goose has literally killed every living thing on the map already, so there isn't really anything that he can attack. This instead just means that he's going to wander around for a bit shouting at rocks, which in the grand scheme of things is pretty harmless. The rabbits are dead, we have food for a couple of meals at least, and the catharsis bonus from his rage wearing off should keep him stable long enough that I can use him to build up a proper house. Goose comes to his senses sometime around mid-morning the next day, and is sent back out by yours truly to pick up his other rabbits. And Randy, once again, sends me pizza in the form of yet another rabbit. I can only assume that this one came into the map right before the animal taming event triggered, since I was certain I got all of them that were around last night, but I'm not going to turn my nose up at free food. This brings up another interesting point, in that I am going to need to constantly monitor the wildlife. Animals can still enter the map, but they're not going to stay long because there's nothing for them to eat, and any predators are going to try and hunt down Goose before they leave. This makes predation less of a risk and more of a certainty, so I want to make sure that Goose has doors to retreat behind once the locals start getting the munchies. Now that the immediate risk of starving to death has been mitigated, it's time to start engaging in some quality of life improvements. I've stabbed enough snow hares by this point that I can try and make a bedroll using light leather left over from the butchering process, which is a substantial upgrade to my current sleeping arrangements, which is snow. Good beds are important in Rimworld, so I'm quite disappointed when he fails. The second improvement is a horseshoe ring, which is a cheap, low-quality recreation item that will hopefully be interesting enough to keep Goose from losing his few remaining marbles. Given that he is being entertained by throwing imaginary horseshoes, because I sure didn't make any of those, at a piece of rebar sticking out of the ground, I am of the opinion that perhaps this is already a lost cause, but he seems to be having fun anyway. Since the bedroll was a bust, I have to turn to my more time-consuming option. I have plenty of steel, albeit in a not terribly useful format, so I set Goose to the task of ripping out a bunch of it with his bare hands to assemble into a proper bed, a stool, a small table, and enough walls that I can cram all of this into the space around the geothermal vent. Small rooms are very difficult to maintain stable temperatures in because of how heat works in Rimworld, but a larger space with carefully managed roofing can usually keep colonists from suffering from hypo or hyperthermia, even if they are terribly comfortable. This plan, at least, goes off without any problems, but trouble of an entirely different variety rears its ugly head in the middle of it. Goose is hungry. Again. And there's nothing left to eat on the entire map. There is basically only one way for me to deal with this, and that is to hope I get lucky with an ancient danger. Because of reasons, I didn't start with any other extra sources of spare food to tide me over to my first raid, and since I started as a solo colonist, I'm not eligible for the Man in Black event. Sadly, my ancient danger ends up being mechanoids that I don't have a hope of fighting, so that plan goes out the window, and I have basically no other options other than starving to death. Until, at the 11th hour, Randy takes mercy on me and throws another rabbit at me. Looks like Goose gets to live to fight another day. Right on the heels of the last, another hare spawns in almost before I even have the chance to finish eating the first one. I'm a little bit confused at this point, since in my experience the spawn rates for animals usually are not this high, but I'm not going to look a gift lunch in the mouth, and in retrospect I may have been basing my experiences off of sea ice runs, which I believe have lower animal spawn rates, though I can't recall the specifics. Either way, this might possibly be enough to last until my first raid pops. Keep holding on, Goose. Thankfully, Goose doesn't have to hold on for long. I'd like to introduce you to Woody. Woody is a lovely little pawn who has volunteered to be the first member of what I would like to refer to as the Club Sandwich Club. The problem is Woody is not starving to death, and Goose is, so Goose does not have a hope of winning a fair fight in his current condition. So, let's make it less than fair. Introducing the Steel Spike Trap, a tool for those with excellent engineering skills and less than excellent everything else skills. These are great options for one-shotting just about any unarmored pawn. Except pawns with the tough trait, who resist a significant portion of incoming damage. Guess what trait Woody has? Thankfully, resistance is not the same thing as immunity, and the trap does do enough damage that the blood loss eventually drops Woody, at which point the Goose flock becomes the proud owner of a new sandwich and a bit of medical tent experience. This is great, but it is barely enough to take the edge off. A few hours after the raid, Randy heard my prayers and sent me a transport pod. Normally, these are intended to help you, get people into your colony. I chose to interpret this instead as a way of getting people into Goose's belly. This delivery also happens to be wearing something very important to my future survival, and that is a parka. You see, food is going to be a constant problem, and whatever their name was only really enough to get me out of the malnourishment range. Normally, you can rely on raids to supply you with food, as long as your pawn has the cannibal trait, but with the way that Randy works, raids can be spaced out with huge gaps in between, and it is very likely I will not survive until I'm attacked again. Usually, ancient dangers will have some sort of nutrient source that I can try and live off of for a few days, but this particular map has been singularly unlucky, and I have only survived by the skin of my teeth with some lucky rabbit drops. There is simply not enough food on the map to sustain me in the long term. So, why not just leave? Well, until recently, because I would have frozen to death, but with this parka, that is no longer the case, and I am now able to stay outside for an indefinite length of time. So, that's exactly what I do. I pack up what few scraps are worth carrying with me and hoof it off to greener pastures. I own so little that I can carry everything of value on my back, and while I do arrive to my next map tile starving, that really isn't anything new, so I consider this to be a success. Even better, because this is a new map tile, it also comes with a full complement of snow hares, meaning once I arrive, I'm granted a free fresh meal of raw meat to gorge myself on. Num num. This also gives me an excellent excuse to show off one of my favorite brands of inventory management cheese. Normally, colonists can only actively haul one item in their hands at a time, which makes sense in the context of the colony survival part of the game, but is incredibly slow. It also happens to be entirely inconsistent with how trade caravans work. Trade caravans don't care about how many items you have, they care about the maximum weight capacity of the caravan members, and that is determined by a number of factors that we don't really care about right now, but usually ends up being far heavier than any one item. If I tell the game that Goose is in a trade caravan, it will give me the option of directly adding items into the caravan, which in this case is just his inventory. Even if I keep him wandering around the map and stabbing rabbits, the game doesn't particularly care, so instead of doing all that caravanning that the game thinks is going on, I can use this as an excuse to carry around a bunch of stuff on my back. This particular trick lets me journey around, stabbing all the snow hares and pointedly leaving the extremely dangerous polar bear alone, without having to individually haul animal corpses around to butcher them. With the last hare defeated, it's time to enact the second part of my plan. Rabbits are great and all, but between my terrible cooking stat, inability to cook the meat at all, and how long it takes to hunt down the stupid rabbits, I'm barely able to keep myself from starving. I need meat. Lots of meat. Lots of polar bear meat. Of course, attacking a polar bear with a knife is a stunningly stupid plan that is all but guaranteed to result in me beefing it, so I have to be smart about it. The first step of my plan is making myself a house, or more specifically, somewhere I can hide behind with a door, so I get started on breaking down some steel for construction materials. I'm quickly interrupted in this by another piece of excellent news. Randy has seen fit to bestow upon me my first colonist. My intention with colonists was to name the ones I intend to keep around after members of my channel, but in the case of Jensen and all the super early volunteers, I'm gonna hold off doing that because fresh colonists have a real short shelf life in these sort of runs. In light of this incredibly short anticipated expiry date, I put him to work on the polar bear trap while Goose takes a well-deserved nap. My eventual plan kind of works, but only in the typical Rimworld comedy of errors way. First, Goose decides he really needs a hit of the good stuff and attempts to binge on the single sole joint of smoke leaf that is available to him. Normally I wouldn't care because smoke leaf in this quantity is essentially harmless, but it does make you hungry and it lowers your consciousness, which are both really bad things to have to deal with right now, so I quickly instruct Jensen to form a caravan to take this dangerous product far, far away from here. Jensen does this, and then immediately after goes on a mental break and wanders around aimlessly while Goose engages in the most depressing smoke leaf binge of all time, gives up, and falls asleep. Cool. That problem solved. And then the polar bear gets the munchies. It first goes after Goose, who has no ranged weapon and is unable to bait the bear into the spike. It then goes after Jensen, which is like, yeah, sure, whatever, and kills him during his mental break. I told you these guys had a short shelf life. After that deed is done and the polar bear had his fill, I sent Goose down to get the auto pistol and whatever was left of Jensen to munch on. Hilariously, none of what happened is actually a problem, and the plan continues on. A little while after this nonsense goes down, I'm presented with another interesting choice. A couple of yaks have joined my first colony map. Side note, colony events are map specific, so you will see me ignore some events while I have both maps up. Don't worry about it, I closed down the redundant map in a bit. Anyway, yaks are a great source of food, and since they're tamed, slaughtering them will yield way more meat than a wild polar bear will. They also like to wander away, so if I want to secure them, I need to head back to the first colony ASAP, even though this risks letting the polar bear wander off the second colony map. I decide to take that risk, pack Goose up, and then have him hoof it back to the first colony. And this ended up being the right call, because I was able to secure and butcher both yaks, ensuring a stable supply of food for the next few days. Apparently, at some point, a raid also triggered here and did Rimworld things, because there are mega scarabs catatonic in the snow up north, the cryptosleep caskets have all been opened, and a couple of the mechs in the Ancient Danger have human wounds. I have no idea when this happened, but I'm not going to turn down help getting rid of the mechanoids. With all of the unsecured gold and stuff down there, they are going to bait raiders in like flies, and I would much rather deal with raiders myself to secure their tenderloins and sandwich meat than risk the robots getting to them first. Ignoring the hows and whys, Goose is in a much better position, in light of not starving to death, for once, so my first priority is to capitalize on that as hard as possible. I need nutrient paste. Badly. Not cooking food effectively halves its nutrition value, and nutrient paste not only cooks it into meals, but it does so with zero risk of food poisoning and twice as efficiently as just cooking it normally does, meaning that I can make my food last 4 times as long if I get one of these setups working. My first run was modified from the Lone Survivalist preset, so this technology is already unlocked for me. I just need the steel and components to build it. Goose, it seems, has other ideas, and decides to have a little temper tantrum because... Fee? Died? Sorry, who? There's literally no one in their social tab, and so far as I know, the only people Goose has interacted with has been lunchboxes. So I guess this was maybe the crash-landed pirate that I captured and brought back to base first? The only other option is that Goose is sad that his imaginary friend died, which is, A, sad, and B, kind of hilarious. He gets over it quick though, so no harm done. I spend the next couple of days having Goose work on the turbine setup and defensive wall for my nutrient paste dispenser. There's no sense building it where raiders can destroy all the expensive parts, after all, and I have enough food stored up that I can afford to take my time. Components are going to be a major pain in the butt to secure for a while, and I want to avoid wasting them. The only interesting thing that happens during this is an ironically backstoried pawn by the name of Blackjack being delivered to me as a convenient Randy brand food shipment. Nothing personal, Blackjack. Randy comes for all of us eventually. As if hearing my scripting and interpreting it as a complaint, immediately after writing that, Randy sends me a raid. This time, it's a pirate, armed with a machine pistol, which is a shockingly effective weapon against short-range unarmored targets. It's also of awful quality, making it literally the worst possible ranged weapon in the game. I decide that I want the meat, though, so I go ahead and open my doors, set up a trap, and wait with a knife in case the trap isn't enough. It is enough, and for the low price of 45 steel, which is not low at all, ouch, I net myself snackies for the next couple of days. A few more days of hard labor and fresh snackies, and Goose is finally able to enjoy his first nutrient-paced meal. Well, enjoy is a strong word. Goose is ready to only mildly hate his first nutrient-paced meal. Might be a better way of describing the experience, but at least it isn't raw meat. I would say you get used to the taste after a while, but I know for a fact that that's a lie, so suck it up, Goose. It's really better than the alternatives. A few more days of mining and construction later, and Goose is now the proud owner of a brand new base, complete with a decent reserve of food. As long as the wind doesn't go out, so let's maybe work on that. In light of this rather obvious mode of failure, Goose's next task is research. His first one is batteries, because stable power is a requirement for doing just about anything, and then I'm gonna push him straight. I don't even know what I'm gonna have him research, we'll see. Because I'm not allowed to have nice things, research is immediately interrupted by a migrating pack of Arctic wolves. They aren't hostile, yet, but I have not a chance in the world of surviving if I'm caught outside when that changes, so I decline that particular offer of an early run-in from Randy and have Goose continue researching. In the meantime, I make sure to convert all of my raw food into nutrient paste using the good old draft and forbid strategy. When a pawn is hungry, make them get a meal. When they hold the meal, draft them and forbid the meal that they drop. If you do this and they're standing right next to the nutrient paste dispenser, you can repeat it endlessly to endlessly convert all of the food in the paste dispenser's bins into pre-prepared meals. This used to be a lot stronger since paste meals didn't have as stringent of storage requirements, but it was nerfed so that unfrozen paste meals decay in 24 hours. But, it never gets above freezing out here, so this just works fine for me. Hilariously, it also implies that every time Goose has a nutrient paste meal, he's actually just eating a nutrient paste popsicle, which sounds so deeply unpleasant that I'm almost a little bit sympathetic for him. It turns out I may have been too hasty in my removal of the geothermal hotbox. While my apparel was more than sufficient for the summer, during the cold, stormy nights in the winter, temperatures dip well below negative 50 degrees centigrade, and I have no heaters with which to combat that. This necessitates something of a panicked rush build of a fresh new hotbox to keep Goose from turning into a goose-sickle, followed by a far more measured collection of the materials for and the subsequent assembly of a heater. Not freezer, maybe. Heater implies that the room it is in at some point becomes warm, and currently the place is sitting at a balmy negative 23 degrees Celsius, but it is at least enough to avoid hypothermia. Mostly. More time passes. Goose is singularly awful at doing research. You're gonna have to work on that, buddy. I can't have my avatar slacking off down there. So, not much has happened, but I do end up with a solo wolf at the top of the map. Since wolves eat nutrient paste meals, I decide to prop open my doors and see if I can bait it in and hunt it with the good old hide-and-seek strategy. Even better, the wolf is soon joined by a polar bear. I don't remember if the two hunt each other, but I'm pretty certain they do, so I'll have to keep an eye on it and see if I can score some easy dog kibble. Randy does end up ringing the dinner bell, but it isn't the wolf and bear on the table. Instead, it's a couple of raiders that seem to have gotten monstrously lost somehow. Also, it definitely appears that polar bears eat wolves, and it succeeded. What do you know? I go ahead and deploy a trap for protection, but it turns out that I needn't have bothered. It is so cold in the winter that even pawns with decent cold weather gear freeze to death before they reach the base. One of them gets down before they even cross half the map, and the other is moving so slowly by the time that they get to me that I use the opportunity to train some shooting skill before finishing them off as well. I, of course, have Goose retrieve both them and the wolf, because there's no sense sharing with a polar bear. Apparently, the bear's doggy dinner is enough to tide it over for a few days, because the next interesting event is Randy continuing in his deluded quest to give me more colonists, as I am joined by yet another new pawn, which presents me with something of an issue. You see, playing with one pawn is really, really slow, and it is not terribly safe. There are a lot of things on the rim that can be survived by two pawns that one will simply perish to. But this is 500% difficulty in a frozen wasteland, and I am already starting to get 2-on-1 raids. I can't really feed more people, and I also can't really afford to raise the amount of aggro I generate by having a second pawn, because the more pawns you have, the more raiders Randy can send at you. This is not a linear relationship, and usually what I try to do is be brutally stingy with who joins until I have enough firepower and force multipliers to handle the absolutely nutty raids that will result. So, sorry Stone, into the icebox you go. Randy, the eternal jokester that he is, decides that instead of trying to get the bear to eat me, he will instead give it to me as a present, and the bear self-tames right before it's ready to start looking for another Scooby snack. No complaints here, but for the same reason that I'm not taking regular pawns, I'm also not going to be keeping animals. Animals add to your colony threat level way more than steaks do, after all, and I'm only surviving because I'm so poor nobody wants to attack me. Batteries finish up in another couple of days, and I turn my attention to smithing. Microelectronics is another safe bet, but I don't immediately benefit from a lot of the stuff it unlocks, whereas machining can let me create better weapons and turrets further down the line. A few more quiet days of nothing except Randy throwing more food sources at me, and the smithing is done. This is really where the fast learner trait starts to shine, because Goose went from a level 1 numpty to a level 7 tolerably good researcher in 2 research projects, and that has vastly sped up the process. Careful there, Goose. Wouldn't want that massive brain of yours to get stuck in the door or something. The next raid goes off without incident. One pawn with a club is not particularly threatening even in a normal playthrough, but combine that with hypothermia, dense snow and ice slowing the pawn to a crawl, and the general lack of ranged options afforded to a club, and you essentially end up with a stack of DIY nutrient paste wrapped in a parka hand-delivered to my front door. It seems Randy must be getting bored, or possibly just desperate, because his next play to power is sending a mildly irritated doggy to hound me in my base. I decline to be dogged and instead just use the thing as an opportunity to train shooting. Goose is not a terribly great shot, by which I mean he's utterly abysmal, and the awful quality pistol is not a terribly great weapon, by which I mean it is utterly abysmal, so there's plenty of room for improvement all around. I don't even really care about the meat at this point, because I have far more than I need, and the only reason I'm not taking a second colonist in is because I couldn't survive stronger raid sizes. Another day on the rim, another raider, and another opportunity to train shooting. This raider is special, though, and drops some herbal medicine as loot. This could very well be life-saving. Infections in this game have 0 chill, climate notwithstanding, and without a solid doctor or good quality medicine, you either amputate or you die. When I say a single piece of herbal medicine can make the difference between life and death, I am in no way exaggerating. Bad luck strikes in the form of fibrous mechanites. Sorry, Goose, you're just gonna have to deal. Yeah, exactly like that. Great going, Goose, you're really rising to the occasion. 2 more research projects worth of nothing much happening other than Randy drowning me in food sees me unlocking basic production and blowback operation. These are nice to have, but I want gas operation before I'm willing to waste components crafting better weapons, so they're just filler at this point. During this time, poor Goose has been constantly suffering from a -20 mood debuff as a result of the fibrous mechanites, 15 for the pain that they cause, and 5 for being sick with something in the first place. This is offset by a recreation routine of as much as possible whenever possible, and a carefully managed diet of nutrient paste and a small quantity of raw sandwich meat, with the sandwich meat granting him a +20 moodlet for the excellent flavor. Weirdo. The raw meat does run a risk of food poisoning, which I would very much like to avoid, since I'm pretty sure it just straight up will down Goose instantly when he's affected by mechanites. But if Goose goes on a break, any number of bad things can also happen, so this is very much a game of me choosing my devils. Also, Smart Speed, which is one of the quality of life mods I put in, is putting in work. I forgot how slow ice lock starts are, and it is making this far more bearable. Because I'm a psychopath that can't resist poking bears, I decide to put a couple holes in a thrumbo that wandered into the area. Actually taking the thing down with an awful quality auto pistol is simply not gonna happen, but my hope is that I can get it to rampage into the mechanoid cluster that's defending the ancient danger so I can go steal all the goodies. This does not work at all, but apparently Randy liked the thought, because not 10 seconds after I realized my plan failed did he send me some more gold anyway. I'm not gonna complain, but I do have to wonder if this game is jacking my microphone sometimes. He also sends me another prisoner immediately after, so forget the microphone theory, he is just straight up a mind reader. For the last little bit, I have been making some plans that could use a willing volunteer, but can make do with an unwilling one, and I finally have enough excess food to support that. They are, admittedly not morally fantastic plans, but it's something that really does need to happen, so I'm willing to ignore that fact. Moral turpitude aside, those plans will have to wait until the next episode, though, because I am out of time for this one. Thank you for lending me yours, and I hope you enjoyed.